And finally, welcome. So it's really pleased that you could join us today for what's going to be a really interesting overview of Second World War coastal crust defences and what we can learn from them. As I'm sure many of you are aware, this stretch of coastline is really important in terms of its military history. And though little investigation has been done to assess how these defences were sited in the landscape of defence and how they would have operated in the event of invasion. So Chris and the team at CITiZAN, a project which aims to highlight the threats of coastal erosion to fragile archaeological sites, they've been using some really exciting new methods to demonstrate the significance of these poorly understood anti-invasion defences in the Second World War. So Chris is a community archaeologist and he is a specialist in the field. So I'm going to hand things over to him now, and he can take us through this journey of discovery.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Tish. Right. Yeah. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. Yeah, my name's Chris. Like Tish said, with that lovely introduction, I'm a community archaeologist with the CITiZAN project. I specialise in Second World War anti-invasion defences and a wide range of other archaeological sites from the Second World War in the UK. And quite handily, in my job as a community archaeologist with CITiZAN, we get a lot of these on the coast. As you'll see in this presentation, what I'll do is give a very quick introduction to this highly complex period of history, a lot of which goes misunderstood or misinterpreted thanks to a certain 70s sitcom. And we'll look at a survey we did towards the end of 2019, when we could still get out with our volunteers to look at 3 particular pillboxes at Rimac in Lincolnshire. So for those, oh, 1 second, here we go. There we go, that's better. For those of you wondering, CITiZAN stands for the Coastal and Intertidal Zone Archaeological Network. We are a project that works in England, on the coast, funnily enough, and in the intertidal zones, to record vulnerable and at-risk coastal archaeology before it's lost forever. So here's me with our volunteer John on the east coast of Yorkshire, recording the remains of a First World War pillbox. And you can see this has been massively messed up by the increased coastal erosion on the boulder clay cliffs there, which is a quite common theme on the east coast of, in particular in Yorkshire, where the boulder clay is eroding at about a metre a year. And as a result, a lot of archaeology has been lost. And, you know, we were set up to help people record it before it's lost forever. So we are a Molar-run project. So that's Museum of London Archaeology. Don't hold that against us. We're very much based up here in the north. In 2019, we received 3 years additional funding from the Heritage Fund to undertake a second phase of the project. So we first started in 2014. And this second phase is taking place from 2019 to 2022. We've had additional funding from Lloyd's Register, and we work with project partners, the Council for British Archaeology, the Nautical Archaeology Society, Historic England, National Trust, Crown Estate, and various others. So in the second phase of the project, before we were working on the entire coast of England, we've condensed that down into 5 what we call discovery program areas. So we've got Liverpool Bay on the west coast, we've got Homicide on the east coast up here, which are the best ones, and then some down south which you don't really need to know about. All you need to know about is these really good ones up here. And as I've already mentioned, we were set up as a response to threatened archaeology. So with increased coastal erosion as a result of rising tides and increased storm events, a lot of archaeology has been lost on the coast. We also have the kind of opposite of that as well, where a lot of stuff's been revealed through tidal scour. And as a result, a lot of this stuff, it's not practical to preserve it physically. So we push for preservation by record, which allows us to create a detailed archaeological record to ensure the preservation, not necessarily of the physical site, but of the information associated with that site. And obviously with the coast being particularly big, we're particularly community led. So we are very keen to work with members of the public and coastal communities to give them the skills and provide them training to ensure that they can identify and record vulnerable archaeology. So we've got a website and a recording app where you can get involved, and I'll provide details for those later for anyone who's interested. Another key feature of the project is as well, we have several specialists, you know, such as myself, who specialise in various periods of archaeology, and we're more than happy to respond to communities' needs in terms of providing training, you know, and just generally hearing what skills you are interested in learning. Excuse me while my voice gets even gravelier. So yeah, we're always keen to hear from people. If you want to get in touch and get involved, then check out the website, which I'll highlight at the end. So focusing on the Homicide Discovery Programme area, this is a relatively large area that focuses on the stretch of coast and the intertidal zone from Flamborough in the north, all the way down to Gibraltar Point in Lincolnshire, and then the inland area of the River Humber. So what's really cool about this is we have a massively diverse landscape to work in. So we've got the, you know, the heavily eroding coastline in Holderness, and then we've got the kind of dunes and the shifting landscape and the Lincolnshire coast, and then inland we've got the really muddy Humber as well. So a load of stuff going on. But what's even cooler about this is the fact that we have pretty much a whole range of human activity, past human activity going on in this coastal area that's being revealed and can be explored further. So everything from Paleolithic landscapes and Bronze Age forests like the one at Cleethorpes, through to more modern things such as Victorian development and industry, all the way through to even more modern stuff like the First and Second World War and Cold War coastal defences. So a whole range of things going on, and there's generally something there to grab people's attention or to suit your specific interests. You know, there's a lot going on. If you ask us to see something, we can generally find it for you. And obviously after last year, we're very keen to get out again. So all being well, we'll be able to do some more stuff this year. So I'm clicking things, there we go. Right, so that brings me on to my particular area of interest, and that's wartime anti-invasion defence. So I've been doing this for about 17 years in total, 9 years professionally, which has seen me look at a lot of anti-invasion defences, anti-aircraft batteries, and a whole range of other stuff across the country. But in particular, I've focused my research on Filey Bay, which is just outside of Lincolnshire by a few miles, but in particular Northern Command, which we'll look at in more detail later. So generally, when I talk about wartime defences and the wartime landscape, this period image is exactly what I'm talking about. So we've got a nice big Second World War brick shuttered pillbox here with a nice supporting trench, which are often forgotten, and, you know, standard soldier in the centre there. And this gives us a good idea of what the landscape would have looked like in, you know, between 1940 and 42, when these defences were largely in use. And what's really cool is that this gives us an idea. Looking at the same landscape today, for example, you could think of how it's changed. You know, generally what we see today is a fraction of what was constructed. So, you know, you'll see an isolated pillbox in the landscape, but what necessarily doesn't survive are the associated trench works, the ephemeral defences such as barbed wire, and the intangible defences that didn't necessarily leave a mark on the landscape, like the mobile reserves and battalions posted just inland of the coastal crust. You know, and the various other formations of troops which supported this front line during the Second World War, and which very little research has been done on. Yeah, and what's really cool is that we can start to build up a picture of, you know, what the individual soldiers went through as well, with proper, decent documentary research, which is something that's vitally important to this, you know, this area of history and helping us properly understand it. And hopefully something that we'll look at further today. Anything else to say about image? It's a rather nice pillbox, it's camouflage, but yeah, this gives us a really nice idea of how things would have looked, you know, generally on the coast, but there was a lot of variation across the country. So before we look at the defences themselves, we actually need to take a closer look at the people who were responsible for planning and the overall construction, you know, and guiding defensive strategy at various points during the Second World War. So what's really cool about 1940 in particular is that we have, you know, very rapid changeover in people responsible for planning them, planning these defences. And the first person to take a look at is General Walter Kirk. So he was the Commander-in-Chief of Home Forces from the outbreak of war in September 1939. And just to explain, the Commander-in-Chief of Home Forces was responsible for army operations on home turf in the UK, and also responsible for general planning and strategy and defence. And Kirk is generally overlooked, even though he had a very, very key role in the anti-invasion defences of 1940. So he was key to developing the Julius Caesar plan, which was put in place less than a month after war declared. And this was the first consideration of large-scale, or the possibility of large-scale invasion and what to do should an invasion come. You know, there was a fear at the outbreak of war that the Germans just arrive, you know, as there had been the First World War. Yeah, and this is something that's looked at in more detail in this book called Stopping Hitler, which I recommend getting a copy of because it's fairly cheap online at the minute, and it's an official account of this whole area of history, and it's very detailed. It gives you the, you know, really good understanding of how things changed relatively quickly in a short period of time, and what was actually being done to defend the country. But what's really cool about Walter Kirk is that he was the first person responsible for actually preparing an active scheme of anti-invasion defence in May 1940. So when you say anti-invasion defence and, you know, all that, everyone seems to think of the South Coast and, you know, after the fall of France. But the first true anti-invasion threat, or the first threat of invasion, came following the fall of Norway and Denmark in May 1940, following Operation Weserübung by the Germans, which there was a very, very big threat perceived by you know, the military at the time. The Germans were only 300 miles away from the Shetland Isles in the north, and that could be used as an invasion point to hit northern Scotland. So there was a key effort put together by Kirk in May 1940 to fortify Shetland and start fortifying the whole of the east coast, because that flank had been completely opened up following the invasion of Norway. And this is something which is completely forgotten nowadays. You know, everything's focused around the south coast and France, when in reality the first vulnerable spots of coast were, you know, up in the Shetlands, Scotland, and all over the east coast. Kirk was also responsible for putting together the plan to establish a force of local defence volunteers that would later become the Home Guard. And, you know, generally this is attributed to Anthony Eden for some reason, because he made the radio announcement calling them up, and Winston Churchill because he changed their name in July, when in reality it was Kirk's recommendation that got the approval to form this body of men who were either too old or too young for active service, who had experience of weaponry, and where ideally had experience of war, having fought in the First World War. But nowadays the Home Guard are generally seen as the primary force, when in reality they, you know, they developed over time into a primary force, but initially they weren't responsible for, you know, coastal defence. But we'll look at that in more detail. So a key theme that we'll see going on in between May and August 1940 is the relatively quick replacement of these commanders-in-chiefs of home forces. So as you can see there, Kirk was retired in May 1940. He was replaced by a chap called General Ironside, or General Edmund Ironside. And this guy is relatively well known for his stop line strategy, but as we'll look, that was a relatively short-lived strategy in itself. So appointed as CNC of Home Forces on the 27th of May 1940, just in time for the evacuations from Dunkirk, Ironside was given the kind of unenviable task of reorganising the army that were being dragged out of Dunkirk, and also putting together a cohesive defensive strategy based on the foundation put down by Walter Kirk before him. One key thing to mention here, though, is that, you know, although Dunkirk gets all the attention, it was one of several evacuations from the North French, ports on northern France and eastern France, and also didn't mark the end of fighting in France either. France didn't capitulate till, you know, 2-3 weeks later. But Dunkirk is always seen as the end of fighting in France, when in reality it wasn't. So at this point, this is the, you know, Ironside's faced with many problems, including, you know, a relatively disorganized army that needs to regroup following the fighting in France, and also a serious lack of weaponry in which to defend the country. And he comes up with a very specific defensive strategy to kind of prepare the country for the, you know, perceived immediate invasion that might come, which obviously it didn't, but, you know, they didn't know that at the time. So as I already mentioned, in keeping with the relatively quick turnover of commanders-in-chief of home forces, Ironside managed to last about 2 months before he himself was replaced by General Alan Brook on the 19th of July 1940. And a key thing to mention here is that Brook had served in France, literally a couple of months before, and had a really good working idea of how the Germans were implementing this combined arms strategy, which they became famous for, known as Blitzkrieg nowadays. And he'd learned a lot from commanding troops in France, and got a good idea of what how the Germans would have operated had they made landfall and touched down on the coast here. But what's really key about Brook is that he implemented a completely different strategy, which we'll look at shortly, which built on the work that Ironside had got going, which is the key thing. And also had the relative luxury of increased arms production. Weapons that had been lost in France were quickly being replaced, and he had a lot more to play with in terms of a mobile reserve, which Ironside had at his disposal, but not on the same level that Brook had to play with. But like I say, this is a massively complicated piece of history that's not as clear cut as many people think, and it's something on a more localized scale, something that's vitally, desperately in need of proper research to work out what's going on at a local level, which we'll look at ever so shortly. So yeah, Brook kind of kicked the trend of people getting retired, and he managed to keep on in the position of Commander-in-Chief of Home Forces up until December 1941, where he was bumped up the chain of command to act as the Chief of Imperial General Staff, and he went on to do some very exciting things. And he was replaced by General Sir Bernard Paget, who took on the role of C&C of Home Forces. But we're not going to focus on Paget, because the key thing is the defensive strategy that was developed by Brook and implemented remained in place up until 1943-ish, when the anti-invasion defences started to be drawn down. In some places they'd even been abandoned as late as as early as 1941 in Scotland and elsewhere. But Brook's strategy remained key to the defensive, defensive landscape in this relatively early period of the Second World War. So towards the end of June, as I've already mentioned, most people think that the main threat was from, the Dover Strait and from that little green area in France. And this is a very detailed graphic that I definitely didn't stick together in Microsoft Paint. But this gives you a better idea of what the actual situation was. So I've already mentioned the threat from Norway via Shetland. That was a key concern for the, military. We've also got further vulnerable coasts from also Norway, Denmark, possible invasion attempt on East Anglia from northern Germany and the East Coast, threat from Belgium on East Anglia, the obvious one down here, the threat across the shortest stretch of coast. And this threat, which was taken very seriously by the military, was the possibility of the Germans capturing Ireland and launching an attack on the west coast. So although today, like I say, most people focus on this relatively small area here, in reality, the invasion threat was much more widespread than most people actually realize. And this is the reason why, pretty much the entire coast was fortified. The Allies didn't know where things were going to come from. So they couldn't take anything by chance. And, you see it from the Cabinet War Papers and elsewhere that they spent a lot of time theorizing what could happen just in case, which is really, really interesting. This plays a key part in helping us understand the vast regional differences in defence, defence types, and why we find defences as far north as Scotland and Shetland as well, which is something that's often overlooked. Although now in hindsight, we do know that the Germans planned their invasion to hit the south coast. Like I say, the defenders didn't have that benefit of hindsight. And this gives you a better idea of what the situation was in June 1940. So before we move on to the defensive strategies themselves, it's always useful to consider how this country was split up into various commands which would be used to implement the defensive strategies outlined by the likes of Kirk, Brook and Ironside. So the way things went, the country was divided up into a series of commands. So these were Scottish, Northern, Western, Southern, London Command and Eastern Command. And the idea behind this is that it's really important to divide the country up into these administrative areas where people who had their boots on the ground could implement defensive strategy as they saw fit, taking into account local topography, local defence needs, and a whole range of other things. The main thing being that, if you set up a defensive strategy to employ in on the coast of Scotland, it might not necessarily work, in Lincolnshire or Yorkshire or in Kent. And it was very, very important that the people implementing this defensive strategy were able to take into local defence needs and local topography. This is one of the reasons why we see so much variation in defence types as well, even within the commands themselves. So each command was further subdivided into brigades, divisions, battalions, all the way down to, section command. And this meant that the defensive strategy that was outlined by the Commander-in-Chief of Home Forces could be tailored specifically to very precise areas on the coast. And this, again, is why we see a large difference between defences employed in Lincolnshire to those defended in constructed on the East Yorkshire coast, and the same from the East Yorkshire coast to the North Yorkshire coast. There were different people responsible for defending these areas, and they implemented this strategy how they saw fit, using the defences that they thought they would need. And this goes some way to explaining, the wide range of defence types that we see employed across the country and the wide range of variation that we see. Unfortunately, today, we've got a generally good idea of what's going on nationally, but a relatively poor idea of what's going on at a more local level within these commands in terms of documentary research and field work being done on the ground to explain these differences in defences as well, and work out concentrations of defences and variation across the country as well, which is something that's in much need of closer attention. So, looking at the defensive strategies, this is the one that most people know about, and that's Ironside stop lines. As I mentioned, Ironside lasted till 19th of July 1940. His defensive strategy in total lasted a total of 2 months. Even though this is the thing that people always mention is like, oh, stop lines and all this, that as a defensive strategy lasted a very, very short period of time when you consider that the anti-invasion defences were active until 1943. Ironside's strategy focused on, using these linear stop lines, including the coastal crust on the coast, secondary stop lines inland to hinder movement further, and then the GHQ line to protect the industrial heartland of the country. What's often not attributed to Ironside is the establishment of nodal points, which we'll look at in more detail in a second, which sat between the coastal crust and, the GHQ line. But this is the strategy that grabs everyone's attention, even though it's a very, very temporary one. So as soon as Brook took over command, within the space of a couple of weeks, he'd halted construction of the GHQ line and these static stop lines, and set about completely changing the defensive landscape as we see it. One cool thing worth pointing out is that the GHQ line in Northern Command, which we'll be looking at in more detail in a second, was never actually constructed. They'd planned to carry out the defensive plans and construct their section of the GHQ line on the Trent and I think it's the Ouse. And by the time they were getting anywhere near constructing that, the plans had changed and they never got around to doing it. They'd focused most of their attention on the coast and building these nodal points and demolition belts inland. So we see a seismic change under Brook, and he changed the strategy completely based on his experiences fighting in France. So he focused more on these nodal points, also established anti-tank islands, defended localities and centres of resistance. And where possible, these were based around places where these static stop lines had already been constructed under Ironside. Obviously, you didn't want to go around having to build more defences when you've got stuff there that you can incorporate into this new strategy. And the idea behind this is that you falsify places where the road and rail network converge, important crossroads, important towns and cities, and you essentially deny the road network to an invading force. So key to Blitzkrieg was the use of the road and rail network to quickly push inland with vehicles. And by denying that and fortifying pretty much every point that the Germans would need to travel through, you make it extremely difficult for them to push inland. Eventually, the idea was that if they took on these nodal points, etc., head on, they would use up vital resources and lose troops. And if they ignored them and tried going round, these centres would continue to fight in the rear, eventually stalling the push inland, at which point a counterattack, mobile counterattack could be launched from the GHQ reserve, and also locally as well, using the mobile reserves that were posted within these defensive networks as well. This is the information taken out the Council for British Archaeology's Defence of Britain projects, which ended in 2002. You'll see there's a distinct lack of stuff up here, so there's a lot more research required to identify nodal points and etc. up here. I've done some of that in East Yorkshire on my section, where I've been doing research and picked out some of these nodal points, which were key to this defensive strategy employed in North Yorkshire. Hopefully that gives you an idea of what was going on nationally. And like I say, this is a period of history which needs a lot more research to be done, especially at a local level, but I might be able to do a talk on that another time. So that brings us over to Lincolnshire and how Lincolnshire fits into this. So back in October 2019, we did a survey as part of a training weekend with volunteers at Rimac in Lincolnshire. For those of you who don't know the area, it's a stretch of coast that sits just there where the big red circle is, between Mablethorpe and Saltfleet. Within the Saltfleet, the Theddelthorpe Dunes, which is now a very big nature reserve. So we focused in particular on 3 pillboxes within the nature reserve. These are references 26005, 26004 and 26003, nice and catchy. And we chose the survey area because you've got 3 of these pillboxes within a relatively close area, and we could easily spend a day with volunteers showing them how to investigate this landscape and look at these things in more detail and record them to new archaeological standards as well. Quick thing to point out, during the Second World War, this stretch of coast was defended by the regular army. The Home Guard weren't responsible for coastal defence until much later in the war. So we're looking about 1943 that the Home Guard started to take a frontline role in coastal defence. But this changes across the country. You know, you've got different things going on in different places. In particular in Northern Command, you know, everyone sees the Home Guard as, thanks to Dad's army, has been posted on the coast, but in reality it was the regulars and the territorials that were responsible for that, especially in 1940. In Northern Command, the Home Guard are mobilised further in autumn 1941 and started to be deployed in a more mobile role supporting the regular army. But in reality, it was a very slow, you know, slow process to bring them to speed, train them, turn into an effective fighting force to operate within this within the anti-invasion defences. And like I say, the role of the territorial armies and the regular armies is pretty much all but being forgotten, and is a story that has pretty much been written out of history, unfortunately, as a result of this focus on Dad's army and the Home Guard. And this is something that needs a lot of work to work out who was where, what their experience was in Dunkirk, how long they spent on the coast, because there was a lot of rotation as well. So these units didn't just sit there for the duration of the war. They were moved in and out, went into training, adapted defences, went on elsewhere, you know, and there's a lot of movement going on, which is not quite realised yet. But these are the units that I've been able to identify so far that were responsible for defence at Rimac at various points during the Second World War. So we undertook this survey in October for various reasons. The main one was for me to indoctrinate more volunteers in the way of the concrete, but more importantly, it was to update our record on these 3 pillboxes, to check the validity of the records, because a lot of archaeological records, as we'll see, are very, very simple and don't actually preserve these things by record. It's also to undertake a detailed survey to aid analysis and interpretation of wartime defences, and to act as a general case study for future archaeological recording of wartime pillboxes and other defences as well. And a key part of this was testing a new methodology that I developed to train volunteers how to record wartime pillboxes, you know, using specific features to record and things like that, which I'll post links to this recording methodology, which is published on our website later on. So yeah, we were able to train our volunteers, Jordan, Leanne and Chris, who joined us, show them what to look for, how to read the landscape, and we spent a good good day of this two-part training weekend, looking at the landscape, having a look for other features such as supporting trenches and the like, and just getting a general feel of the landscape and seeing what we can learn from these three structures themselves. And it's worth pointing out as well that this was, the training weekend was run in collaboration with Lincolnshire Wildlife Trust, and a big thank you to Delphine for working with us and helping us sort out the SSI consent and giving us the permission to undertake the survey as the landowner as well. And also a massive thank you to our volunteers for not only helping us out and doing a massively amazing and important job, but also providing their local knowledge, which was key to helping us understand how this landscape's changed over time and how these structures sit in the local landscape themselves. So we were fairly active, undertaking taking measurements, undertaking a photographic survey. We did a whole range of things, which was really, really cool. And it's something we're hoping to do again this year, all being well. So these are the three pillboxes that we surveyed. A huge problem with wartime archaeology and wartime defences and pillboxes in general is that there's a massive lack of detailed recording of these structures. And if you look at this sentence here, that is literally the record we had for each of these three pillboxes. And that tells you next to nothing. It doesn't tell us anything about the form, function, context of the structure, when it was built, what shape it is, which direction it faces, and if these things were to be lost, there's a wealth of information which goes with that as well, which is going to seriously hinder future investigation of these defences in the future, and is already having a massive impact. Generally, most interaction with these things goes no further than taking a photograph and posting on Facebook. And we see a massive lack of interaction with local historic environment records to update records in terms of condition, things like that, and essentially highlighting the significance of these as a key part of the country's history, which is a great shame. And now this is leading to issues during development where the archaeological record doesn't necessarily or doesn't reflect adequately enough the significance of these structures, and as a result they have been lost, which is a massive shame and something that really needs to be changed, which is something I'm working on and something we're trying to do within CITiZAN and elsewhere. So taking a cursory glance at these pillboxes, we knew that the records were very poor, and on first glance they look exactly the same. You'd be hard pressed to tell that those are three different photos of three different pillboxes, but they are. And what was really cool is during the survey, we were able to take a close look at these things and notice some things which have gone unrecorded for 80 years, which is really, really cool, despite a lot of these pillboxes getting a lot of attention by casual observers. Key part of the survey was to take measurements and show our volunteers how to take measurements so that we could reconstruct the pillboxes as 3D models, which is something I've done since, and these are now posted online. I'll post a link in the chat. I've just seen Leanne posting. Thanks, Leanne. Yep, we'll get you involved when we're out again, let you know about that, Leanne. Yeah, so I'll post a link to these models and all the other things I mention at the end of my talk. So this is the pillbox we're looking at. The record said this was a Type 23 Lincolnshire type. Yeah, that doesn't really tell us much. If you don't know what a Type 23 is, you can't draw comparisons. And if you don't know what a Lincolnshire type is, no idea. These are sometimes referred to as the 3-bay, which is quite possibly a nickname coined in the 90s to try and classify these things. But as far as I'm aware, it's not a period term that was used during the war. But they're a relatively simple structure consisting of 2 enclosed chambers, which are similar to this Type 23 design, or the FW3 drawing. FW323 drawing, which was issued by the Department of Fortification and Works. But we don't know, because of a lack of research, whether this was seen as a variant on that design or whether it was assigned its own specific drawing number, which is more than likely. So many of these localized variants were drawn up by the local commands and assigned their own specific number, which makes them a unique design in their own right. But this is an interesting one in that you've got these 2 enclosed chambers with embrasures in 3 of the sides. So these are the holes that you fire out of. And then in the center, we've got this open porch, which is largely or widely believed to be for a light anti-aircraft gun. And that's what the FW323 design says, which is quite possible. Some interesting things about that, which we'll touch later on. The walls are very important. They are reinforced concrete built to 38 centimeters thick, which was 15 inches, which at the time was the standard specification for bulletproof, specification for reinforced concrete to create a bulletproof structure. You also get shellproof pillboxes, which were built to 1 meter 6 centimeters. I can't remember the imperial measurement of that. And they were considered proof against shell and shot fired by tanks, when these things were built in 1940. Worth noting that pillboxes were largely obsolete by the end of 1941 and officially obsolete in early 1942, and construction was completely halted of the Second World War pillbox. The main reason being for this is that as German weaponry increased and got more powerful, especially in terms of tanks as the war progressed, the pillboxes had to be strengthened and thickened. Well, they were in some parts of the coast provided with a thickening skirt to try and make them proof against these larger caliber weapons. But this got to the point where it would become impractical to upgrade all pillboxes, so much so that arcs of fire would be hindered and the structure itself would lose, defensive validity very, very quickly. And they'd also stick out in the landscape and become much more harder to conceal, which is why they were made obsolete in 1942. Construction halted, and they were generally superseded by trench-based defended localities and the like, which again is something that's generally not realised. A pillbox, the construction of pillboxes lasted something like, the main construction lasted 14 weeks or something like this entire period, or something like that. Yeah, they're a pretty cool structure when you start to look at them, and we'll look at later how these things were placed in the landscape. But there's a number of these features which are worth pointing out, such as the thickness of the walls and this light anti-aircraft bay. And then this is the model of all, we surveyed another example at Donanook on a different day, and we ended up with these nice models showing the sometimes subtle variations between these, but no more, massively important features which help show that these things are extremely significant in their local landscape. So one of the key things that we noted in terms of differences between these things, which had gone completely unnoticed for many years, was that each pillbox had a different embrasure configuration. So the first one we surveyed had these basic plain embrasures. The second one, which is this image on the right-hand side, had a recess for the bipod of the light machine gun employed within. And the third one had this large embrasure, which was modified during construction to increase the arc of fire. So this is a south-facing embrasure. There's also one in the north face. And this was designed specifically to increase the arc of fire to the south and to the north. And this was clearly a conscious decision that was either made before these pillboxes were built or during construction, because this was built into the pillbox as a design. And this shows us that there was a lot more thought going into the construction of these things. They didn't just build them all over the place and there was no consideration for local landscape. This clearly shows that someone thought, right, we need or the troops occupying this area need a wider arc of fire to the south. Let's build this pillbox to, incorporate a wider embrasure. And you can't quite see it in the image, but there's also a recess there, which suggests that this embrasure was specifically designed for accommodating the forward leg of machine gun tripod, quite likely the Bren light machine gun tripod, which I've got in my collection at home, and I'm fairly convinced that's what it was designed for, but this is something we would very much like to test out in the future, just to check whether that's right. And then we also had evidence as well of post-construction modification. Again, another feature which has been completely unrecorded. Another south-facing embrasure, the second pillbox we recorded, and you can see this chipping away to the sides of this embrasure. And this has clearly been done by someone operating a machine gun from the pillbox. They've gone, right, well, the arc of fire I've got isn't quite wide enough for what I need. I need a wider arc of fire to cover this beach effectively with fire. Let's modify it. And they've increased that by simply chipping away at the side of the embrasures, which is something you do see quite a lot, but it clearly shows that there's a thought process going on here, that people occupying this position used it and modified it to their needs to allow them to more effectively defend this section of coast. I'll post the links to the site records so you can see the other details that we picked out and get a better idea of the final records that we created through this survey. But these are just two very, very cool features that are worth pointing out. There's a whole range of other things we noticed as well, which help to show the significance of these and the importance of taking a closer look at these things and surveying them properly. So we also got time to investigate the central light anti-aircraft gun well. It was worth pointing out that not every single one of these had this upright post where the gun would have been mounted. And a couple of other things we noticed is that this position is actually relatively cramped. So a light anti-aircraft gun, as with a light machine gun, is operated by two people. You've got the gunner and the assistant gunner. And to have those two people working side by side in there, they'd have been very cramped. But this, again, is something we'd very much like to test out in the future and work out whether it was possible, or work out how complicated it was to operate a light machine gun in that space, and whether your arcs of fire are actually limited as well by the space you have. Another thing that came apparent is when you get someone messing around with a ranging pole to stand up in the center of one of these things, I'm 6'2", the top half of them is relatively well exposed. So if anyone was operating this gun, unless they were crouched down to operate the gun, they would be pretty exposed to incoming fire. And, it's quite possible there was some form of sandbag protection if these positions were ever actually provided with a light anti-aircraft gun, which again is something we don't know due to a lack of documentary research. Yeah, it's something I'd really like to test out and work out whether you could effectively operate a light machine gun in that space. But yeah, we can dream. So a key part of this survey was undertaking a post-survey analysis, which is something that's very, very rarely done. So generally, most surveys, just plot these things in the landscape and go no further. But it's vitally important that we start to look at not just pillboxes, but other defences as part of a cohesive defensive landscape where these pillboxes would have interacted with each other as part of a planned battlefield, essentially. So one of the first things we can do is start to plot the locations within a piece of GIS software, so geographical information software, which I use, and start to investigate these relationships closer, because looking at a pillbox in isolation tells us nothing. It doesn't help us to identify the wider context of these things. So when you plot these into a piece of GIS software, we start to see that there's something going on here in terms of distribution in the landscape, but how can we investigate that further, and how can we explain this? You hear a lot of people say that pillboxes are placed randomly in the landscape. Surely that can't be true. Let's look at how we investigate that. So when I started looking at this stuff in the mid-2000s, when I was doing my A-level in archaeology at Barnsley College, which no longer exists, one of the key things I started to look at to try and explain this defence distribution in the landscape was the weapon systems that were employed and what these pillboxes were designed to accommodate. So these were designed primarily for the regular army and the weapon systems that they used. And at the time, the primary function of a pillbox is to allow soldiers inside to shoot other soldiers without getting shot themselves. And to do that, they use very specific weapon systems. The Department of Fortifications and Work plans show that most pillboxes were designed for the light machine gun, which is, at the time, was the Bren light machine gun with its two-person crew here. So you've got the gunner and the second gunner who would load the gun and collect ammunition, etc. And that was the key weapon of the British infantry section. So every 8 soldiers were organised into a section, and they would have one Bren gun. We also have as well, the key rifle at the time, which was the short magazine, the Enfield, which could also be employed within pillboxes. And this was used extensively during the Second World War, later replaced by the No. 4, the Enfield rifle as well. And then to a lesser extent, in terms of pillboxes, we have the submachine gun as well, which was issued to the section commander. But the Bren and the Enfield rifle are 2 things that we generally take into consideration when interpreting these. So this was looking at these weapon systems was what really sparked my interest in terms of trying to understand these defences and how they sit in the landscape and investigate this further. So one of the key things, that I fell upon was the wartime manuals, which were published to train soldiers how to use these weapons effectively. And one thing that came very clear was that each weapon had a very specific maximum effective range. And this is the maximum range at which you can expect to point a gun at someone, a human-sized target, and hit them. And there were some very key ranges that came came out of these documents. And if you go to the Vickers Machine Gun archive, I've got to butcher that wrong, just search vickersmachinegun.org and you'll find this website. You'll find a lot of the manuals are published on there, and they're a great resource. So using that information taken from these wartime manuals, I started to apply this to, to these structures. And this initially started off as drawing circles on a map, and then has now kind of morphed into this pretty detailed process of using a professional GIS piece of software to automate the process and take it this further. So our volunteers were really good in gathering measurements of these pillboxes, which allowed me to, at the time, assess the general arcs of fire, and then use that to create the 3D models, and then use that to create a model of these arcs of fire with the associated effective range of the light machine gun, and then use that then to plot this information into a piece of GIS software. And one really cool thing that popped out from these pillboxes was that they have an approximate arc of about 60 degrees. I want to confirm this again with, using a period weapon system within the pillbox to confirm that, but I'm fairly certain it's accurate. And when we plot that, we can see that there's some blind spots created within those arcs of fire. And this is one of the key reasons why most pillboxes, well, pretty much all pillboxes, were surrounded by trenches and other defences, was to cover these blind spots within the landscape and to provide a better arc of fire and better visual reference points over the landscape as well. So that was really cool seeing that. And then when you zoom in close, you can see you've got even further blind spots as well within the pillbox's defensive arcs of fire. So this is really, really cool, and a really cool outcome that came about as a result of our volunteers recording these pillboxes in detail. Taking that one step further, we can then apply that to all three pillboxes, and we get this really nice pattern going on. So we can clearly see that each one was sited within the landscape specifically to create interlocking arcs of fire. So that is essentially allowing the people within the pillbox to fire at one point, and also allow that point to be covered by an adjacent pillbox. What that creates is fire from multiple locations onto a specific point on the beach. So any enemy landing on the beach would expect to be hit by multiple positions, which makes it harder to suppress and makes it harder for them to move through this landscape. And this is something that's abundantly clear here when we plot these arcs of fire. We can clearly see that these three pillboxes were intelligently sited within this landscape to maximize interlocking arcs of fire, maximize firepower, and quite clearly cover this vulnerable stretch of beach, which is where you'd expect the enemy to land from. We can also see as well that they quite possibly could have covered the inland approaches as well. But one thing that we noticed during the survey was that you've got this large flood bank behind the pillboxes, which could potentially limit views inland, which was really, really interesting in terms of helping us interpret these defences. And this is something I've been able to kind of replicate here. So you can clearly see that these pillboxes are quite likely to have been specifically sited to cover the beach, which again was the main vulnerable point in this area. And then taking that one step further to investigate whether the weapons could be brought to bear and where they could be brought to bear is the use of lidar data. So about 5 years ago, I started playing around with this as the Environment Agency released their lidar data online. And this has been really, really important for not looking at how far people could see, but assessing where could be covered by weaponry within the landscape. So using this, you can see these different colours which indicate places where these arcs of fire intersect. So I think purple is a place where a single arc is, and red is where 3 arcs of fire intersect, and turquoise where 2 intersect. And by doing this view shed analysis, we can clearly see that the weapons very much were limited to this forward arc, but it was quite possible that they could, fire inland along the dunes here. But this is really important. It shows that although this landscape's changed, we can clearly see that the arcs of fire were clearly interlocking immediately to the front of these pillboxes, out to a range of about 400 yards, after which you get some dead space, which is quite possibly as a result of modern change and modern accretion. And then we can clearly see that these arcs of fire clearly interlock here. So what's really cool about this is we can start to assess points in the landscape where enemy troops could seek cover, and we can also assess whether the pillboxes were specifically sited to cover this dead space with effective fire. But one thing that we can clearly see here is that they were, again, intelligently sited to maximize effective fire. So the next step is to test this out on the ground and see how this matches up with the landscape today. And obviously this works better in landscapes that have changed very little since the Second World War. So one observation made by our volunteer Chris was that this landscape has changed significantly since the Second World War. And the main change has been that a lot of this area to the front of these pillboxes has accreted and turned to salt marsh and is now part of the dunescape itself. During the Second World War, these pillboxes, which were located just below the T in Clement, were right on the coast edge themselves. And in front of them would have been a large stretch of beach. So you've got the low tide mark represented further out, and the kind of high tide mark there represented as well. If we just go back to this interpretation, we can clearly see that these pillboxes were sited pretty much to cover up to the low tide mark, so out to about 1,000 yards, give or take. Again, taking into account local considerations. And if you looked at the landscape now, the coast is a lot further out than you might realize it was in the 1940s. And this was a key development from this survey as well, was assessing the landscape as it was in 1940. And thanks to the local knowledge provided by our amazing volunteers, you know, this helps us to better understand this placement in the landscape. So I know that's been a lot to take in. I'll post the links to further information later on, but what do we want to do next? Well, 2020 has been largely a write-off in terms of being able to do what we wanted. But hopefully this year we'll be able to get to the National Archives and look at the war diaries for this area. So there's a massive myth that pillboxes were built so quickly that records were never kept. That's completely untrue. There was a massive amount of data collected by the people constructing these defences, so much so that they were keeping logs of every brick used in construction, every ton of concrete, and where resources were being allocated. There's a massive information held within the National Archives that very few people actually take the time to look at. So that was something we were hoping to do in 2020. Maybe we'll get to do in 2021, and investigate the wider defensive scheme, how the Home Guard sat into that, how the mobile reserves and the regular army sat in that defensive landscape, and help put these pillboxes within their wider context within this section of Northern Command. Another key thing that I was hoping to do was to get the 1940s RAF aerial photographs, which are held by Historic England in their archive, but they were obviously shut. But these aerial photographs are very, very key to helping us build up an actual snapshot of what the landscape looked like in 1940. So as I mentioned earlier, today we see the pillbox. Generally, we don't see the barbed wire, the trenches, you know, even though trenches do survive, very few people look for them. And building up that defensive picture is key to helping us properly assess and understand how effective these defensive landscapes would have been, because obviously they were never used. We don't know how effective they would be, but key to our understanding is properly assessing them and building up a more detailed picture of what we currently see today. So yeah, if you want to get involved, please do check out our website. You can contact me via email. My contact details are on the website. I'll post links to our blogs and the recording methodology and some other information in the chat in a second. Check us out on Twitter and Facebook at CITiZAN1. If you're into Instagram, we're also on there. But yeah, I'll post these links in the chat, and those are my sources, etc. If you want me to post them, I can. Yeah, I'll leave that up for you. Thank you so much. I'll just post the links I mentioned in the chat just now if you want to have a look at those. If you miss them, just email me and I'll send them through. Right, going in the chat now. There we go.
Thanks so much, Chris. That's fantastic. No worries. Just a quick question from Tom Collins. He's asked, could those open porch areas of concrete pillars, could they be associated with fixed binocular stands to track incoming bombers, etc., as part of fighter command?
Possibly. I really don't know. It's a good idea though. With it being a coastal area as well, and looking right onto, when you mentioned fixed binoculars, I also thought observing coastal shipping. So that's something to consider. If I get around to getting to the archives and find the original plans for these things, it'd be really cool if that was the case. But I like that as you know, as thinking of other uses as well. It's quite possibly that these things were used. We just simply don't know at the minute.
Or is it possible that in those open porches there was a place for a mortar?
No, no, the space is too small. Oh, sorry, I sent the links to Leanne. It was on private. Let me do that again. There we go. No, the space is too small for a 3-inch mortar. You could just about get away with a 2-inch mortar, but it's much easier to build a trench-based position for something like that. And you wouldn't have them on the coast edge either. You'd have them much further inland to take maximum effect of their, effective maximum ranges and things like that. But possible, we simply don't know.
Great, that's interesting.
Oh, there we go.
Okay, so yeah, I think that wraps everything up really nicely. Thank you so much, and to everyone that's joined today. I've just put a couple of links in the chat box as well to Lincolnshire Wildlife Trust and the Dynamic Geoscapes project, in case you want to find out more about that, and to find out more about Lincolnshire Wildlife Trust. So lots of things to keep you busy there.